My stepmother stood in that lawyer's office with a smile I will never forget. It was not a nervous smile or even a hopeful one. It was the smile of someone who believed she had already won. She was wearing a navy blue dress she had bought 5 days after my father's funeral, and pearl earrings I had never seen before. Everything about her screamed victory. She looked at me and my sister like we were strangers who had wandered into a private party, like we did not belong there, like we had no right to sit in those leather chairs and hear what our own father had supposedly decided about his estate. And then she made her announcement. Your father left everything to me. The house, the savings, his pension, the life insurance, everything. You two get nothing. She said it slowly, deliberately, letting each word sink in like a knife. She wanted to see our faces crumble. She wanted tears. She wanted begging. She had spent 5 years poisoning my father against us, convincing him that his own children had abandoned him, whispering lies into his ear until he stopped returning our calls and changed the locks on the house where we grew up. 5 years of watching my father slip away from us. 5 years of wondering what we had done wrong. 5 years of showing up at holidays and being turned away at the door by a woman who smiled and said he was resting. He was not feeling well. He did not want visitors today. And now she stood there in that lawyer's office ready to collect her reward. My sister, Sarah Collins, started crying. Not loud sobs, just quiet tears rolling down her cheeks. She is a hospice nurse. She holds dying people's hands for a living. She has seen more grief than most people can imagine. But this broke something in her. Not the money. Neither of us cared about the money. It was the accusation. The idea that our father had died believing we did not love him. That is what shattered her. I put my arm around her shoulder and pulled her close. I could feel her trembling. Carol Whitman watched us with satisfaction. This was the moment she had been waiting for. This was her complete and total victory over the children who had tried to warn their father about her. The children who had seen through her charm from the very beginning. The children she had systematically erased from his life. But I did not cry. I did not argue. I did not demand to see proof or threaten to contest the will or call her a liar. I just sat there with my hands folded in my lap looking at the lawyer, Howard Keene. Waiting. Carol Whitman's smile faltered just slightly, just for a moment. She had expected a fight. She had prepared for accusations and threats and maybe even shouting. She had not prepared for silence. The lawyer, a careful man named Howard Keene, who had handled my father's affairs for over 20 years, cleared his throat and pulled a stack of documents from his folder. Before we proceed with the distribution of the estate, he said, "There is one document that requires Mrs. Whitman's signature." Carol waved her hand dismissively. "Fine, whatever. Let us get this over with so I can go home." Howard slid a single sheet of paper across the polished conference table toward her. Carol barely glanced at it. She was already reaching for the pen, already imagining herself driving back to my father's house, already planning how she would redecorate the living room now that she did not have to pretend to care about his taste anymore. But Howard stopped her. "Mrs. Whitman, I need you to read the document first. The entire document. It is a legal requirement." She rolled her eyes like a teenager being asked to clean her room. "This is ridiculous," she muttered. But she picked up the paper and started reading. The room went silent. I watched her face. I had been waiting for this moment for 8 months. I had planned for it, prepared for it, lost sleep over it. I knew exactly what that document said. I knew exactly which line would destroy her. Her eyes moved across the page. Her expression shifted from annoyance to confusion to something that looked almost like fear. Her hands began to tremble. The color drained from her face until she looked almost gray. She reached the line near the bottom, the one that changed everything. And then Carol Whitman, my stepmother, the woman who had stolen my father's final years, broke down. crying. My name is Henry Collins. I am 42 years old. I restore antique furniture in a small workshop in Madison, Wisconsin. It is quiet work, patient work, the kind of work my father taught me to appreciate when I was just a boy, learning to sand and stain in his garage. My father was Thomas Collins. He worked for the Postal Service for 39 years before he retired. He was not a rich man or a famous man, but he was the most principled person I ever knew. He believed in fairness. He believed in doing the right thing even when it was hard. He believed that family was everything. And the woman who tried to destroy our family, the woman who isolated him from his children and drained his bank accounts and made his final years a prison of loneliness and manipulation. Her name was Carol Whitman. She thought she had won. She thought she had taken everything. But my father was smarter than she realized. And he had one final gift for his children. She just had not found it yet. To understand what happened in that lawyer's office, you need to understand who my father really was. Not the confused old man Carol tried to make him into the real Thomas Collins. My father grew up in a small town about 45 miles outside Madison. His parents did not have much, but they taught him that hard work and honesty were worth more than any amount of money. He carried that lesson his entire life. When he got a job with the Postal Service at 23, he showed up early every single day for 39 years. Never called in sick unless he genuinely could not stand. Never cut corners, never complained. He met my mother, Marilyn, at a church picnic in 1980. She was 20 years old with red hair and a laugh that could fill a room. He always said he knew he was going to marry her within 5 minutes of their first conversation. They were married for 28 years before cancer took her from us. I was 21 when my mother died. My sister, Sarah Collins, was only 17. I remember sitting in the hospital waiting room with my father, watching him try to hold himself together for us. He did not cry in front of us that night. He waited until we were asleep and then went out to his truck and sobbed alone in the parking lot. I know because I followed him. I stood in the shadows and watched my father's shoulders shake. And I swore to myself that I would never let him face anything alone again. For the next 14 years, that is exactly what we did. We took care of each other. Sunday dinners became sacred. Every week without fail, Sarah and I would show up at the house with our families. My wife would bring potato salad. Sarah would bring whatever dessert she had attempted that week. Dad would grill burgers or steaks, and we would sit around the backyard table and talk until the fireflies came out. When my twin boys were born, my father was the first person at the hospital after my wife's parents. He held those babies like they were made of glass. He started a college fund for them the very next week. Every birthday, every school play, every little league game, my father was there in the front row with his camera. Sarah never married, but she found her purpose in hospice care. She said watching our mother die had shown her that the end of life did not have to be lonely or frightening. She wanted to be the person who held hands and offered comfort when families could not bear to stay in the room. My father was so proud of her that he kept a framed photo of her in her nursing scrubs on his mantle. That was our family. Solid, loving, unbreakable. And then Carol Whitman walked into our lives. My father met her at a fundraiser for the church food bank 5 years before he died. She was 58 years old, recently widowed, and impossibly charming. She had this way of making you feel like you were the most interesting person in the room. She laughed at all his jokes. She touched his arm when she talked to him. She told him how handsome he looked and how lucky his late wife must have been. I noticed something off about her from the very beginning. There was a calculation behind her eyes that did not match her warm smile, but my father had been alone for over a decade. He missed having someone to come home to. He missed companionship, and Carol knew exactly how to fill that void. Within 7 months, she had moved into his house. Within a year, they were married in a small ceremony at the courthouse. Sarah Collins and I attended, trying our best to be supportive. We wanted our father to be happy. We told ourselves that our suspicions were just protectiveness, that we would have found fault with anyone who tried to take our mother's place. But Carol was not interested in joining our family. She was interested in replacing it. The changes started small. Carol would mention that we had not called in a few days even when we had. She would tell my father that Sarah seemed distant at dinner, that I only came around when I needed something. She would sigh and say she wished his children would make more of an effort, planting seeds of doubt so subtly that he did not even realize they were growing. Then the changes got bigger. Sunday dinners became every other week, then once a month, then not at all. Carol said the gatherings were too exhausting for my father's health. When we called, she answered and said he was sleeping. When we showed up unannounced, she said he was not feeling well enough for visitors. I tried to push back. I tried to insist on seeing him. But Carol had an answer for everything. She said I was being aggressive. She said I was stressing him out. She said if I really loved him, I would give him space to rest. The last time I saw my father before his final months, he looked at me like I was a stranger who had disappointed him. Carol stood behind him with her hand on his shoulder, and I knew she had won. Or so I thought. My father died on a Tuesday morning in March. I found out from a nurse at the hospital who recognized my name from his emergency contact list, not from Carol. She had not bothered to call. By the time I arrived at the hospital, his body had already been taken to the funeral home. Carol had made all the arrangements without consulting us. She had chosen the casket, the flowers, the music, the burial plot. She had written the obituary herself, and when I finally read it in the newspaper 2 days later, I noticed that it mentioned his beloved wife Carol 3 times. It mentioned his children once in a single sentence at the very end. The funeral was held on a Saturday. Gray sky, cold wind, the kind of day that matches the feeling in your chest when you bury someone you love. Sarah Collins and I arrived early, dressed in black, expecting to sit in the front row with the other immediate family members. Carol had other plans. She had hired private security for the service. 2 men in dark suits who stopped us at the entrance to the chapel and told us we were welcome to attend, but would need to sit in the back. When I demanded to know why, one of them handed me a note written in Carol's handwriting. It said that our presence near the front would be too upsetting for the grieving widow, and that our father would have wanted her to be comfortable. I wanted to make a scene. I wanted to push past those guards and march up to the front row and tell everyone in that chapel exactly what kind of woman Carol really was. But Sarah grabbed my arm and whispered that this was our father's funeral. She said we could not turn it into a spectacle. She said Dad deserved better than that. So we sat in the back row like distant relatives. We watched Carol dab her eyes with a handkerchief and accept condolences from people who had no idea what she had done to our family. We listened to a minister who had never met our father describe him using words Carol had clearly provided. And when it was over, we drove home in silence, hollow with grief and rage. 14 days later, we received a letter from Howard Keene informing us that the reading of the will would take place at his office downtown. I barely slept the night before, not because I cared about the inheritance. My father was not wealthy. The house was worth maybe $240,000. His pension and savings combined might have added another $130,000. It was not life-changing money. What kept me awake was the thought of sitting across from Carol and hearing her version of my father's final wishes. The law office was in an old brick building on Capitol Avenue, the kind of place with creaky wooden floors and framed certificates on the walls. Howard Keene greeted us in the waiting room with a firm handshake and an expression I could not quite read. He was a tall man in his 60s with gray hair and steady eyes. He had known my father for over 20 years. I wondered what he thought of all this. Carol arrived 5 minutes late, making an entrance. She was wearing that navy dress and those pearl earrings, looking more like she was headed to a cocktail party than a legal proceeding. She did not acknowledge me or Sarah Collins. She simply sat down in the chair farthest from us and began examining her fingernails. Howard closed the door and took his seat behind the desk. He opened a folder and began to speak, but Carol cut him off immediately. "Before we start, I want to make something clear." She turned to face us, and the smile on her face was pure poison. "Your father and I had many conversations in his final months. He was very clear about his feelings. He felt abandoned by both of you. He told me that you never called, never visited, never showed any interest in his life after I came into the picture. He was heartbroken, and because of that he made the decision to leave everything to me. The house, the savings, his pension, all of it. You two get nothing." Sarah made a small sound beside me, something between a gasp and a sob. I felt her hand gripping my arm so hard her fingernails dug into my skin. Carol's smile widened. "I just wanted you to hear it from me first, so there is no confusion." She turned back to Howard with a satisfied expression, like a cat that had just finished playing with a mouse. "Now let us proceed." Howard Keene looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at me, and in that brief glance I saw something that Carol completely missed. He was waiting for me to give him the signal. I kept my face neutral and nodded almost imperceptibly. "Of course," Howard said, reaching for his documents. "Let us begin." What Carol did not know, what she could not have possibly imagined, was that my father had reached out to me 8 months before he died. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon in September. I was in my workshop sanding down an old oak dresser that a client had brought in for restoration. The radio was playing classic. Sawdust was floating in the air, and I was so focused on my work that I almost did not hear the knock at the door. When I opened it, my father was standing there. He looked terrible. He had lost at least 22 pounds since I had last seen him. His clothes hung loose on his frame, and his skin had a grayish tint that I recognized from watching my mother's decline. But it was his eyes that shocked me the most. They were red and wet, filled with a desperation I had never seen in him before. "Henry," he said, "I need your help." I brought him inside and sat him down on the old leather couch I keep in the corner for clients. I made him a cup of coffee and waited while he gathered himself. For a long time he just stared at the floor, his hands trembling around the mug. Then he started talking. He told me everything. He told me how Carol had slowly isolated him from everyone he loved, how she had convinced him that Sarah and I did not care about him anymore, how she had intercepted our phone calls, deleted our voicemails, and thrown away the letters we sent. He told me how she controlled his medications, sometimes giving him more than prescribed to keep him confused and compliant. He told me how she had pressured him into changing his will just 11 months after their wedding, standing over him while he signed the papers. He told me that for the past year he had been living in a prison inside his own home. The worst part was the loneliness. He said there were days when Carol would not speak to him at all except to criticize or complain. She had cut off his access to his own bank accounts, giving him a small allowance for groceries while she spent freely on clothes and jewelry and trips with her friends. She had thrown away most of his photographs of my mother, claiming they were cluttering up the house. She had even sold some of my mother's jewelry without telling him. He wept as he told me this. My father, the strongest man I had ever known, sat on that couch in my workshop and cried like a child. "I am so sorry," he kept saying. "I believed her. I believed her when she said you had abandoned me. I was a fool. I held him for a long time. I told him it was not his fault. I told him that predators like Carol were experts at manipulation, that she had targeted him precisely because he was kind and trusting and lonely. I told him that Sarah and I had never stopped loving him for a single moment. And then I asked him what he wanted to do about it. His answer surprised me. He said he was not strong enough to confront her directly. His heart condition was getting worse, and he knew he did not have much time left. Fighting her openly would only give her ammunition to claim he was mentally incompetent, which would make everything worse. But he had a plan. He had already contacted Howard Keene in secret using a prepaid phone he had purchased at a gas station. Together, they had drafted a new will that superseded the one Carol had forced him to sign. This new will divided everything equally between Sarah and me, with nothing left to Carol except 30 days to collect her personal belongings from the house. But a will alone was not enough. Carol would contest it. She would claim he was confused, that he did not know what he was signing, that his children had manipulated him. She would drag it through the courts for years. My father needed evidence proof of what she had done. That is when I thought of the clock. 4 years earlier, I had restored an antique mantel clock for my father as a birthday gift. It was a beautiful piece over 100 years old with a mahogany case and brass fittings. I had spent weeks getting it to run perfectly. It sat on the mantel in his bedroom, ticking softly through the night. I told my father I could hide a voice-activated recorder inside the clock. It would capture everything that happened in that room. Every cruel word, every threat, every admission of what she had done. He agreed immediately. Over the next 7 months, that recorder captured over 52 hours of audio. Carol's verbal abuse, her financial manipulation, her confession that she had finally gotten rid of those ungrateful brats, everything we needed. My father died knowing that justice was coming. And now, sitting in that lawyer's office, it had finally arrived. Howard Keene slid a single sheet of paper across the conference table toward Carol. She glanced at it with obvious impatience, already reaching for the pen in front of her. "This is just a standard acknowledgement form," Howard said calmly. "It confirms your understanding of the estate distribution and your role as beneficiary. However, I must ask you to read it in full before signing. It is a legal requirement." Carol rolled her eyes. "I do not have time for this. Just tell me where to sign." "Mrs. Whitman, I must insist. Please read the entire document." Something in his tone made her pause. She picked up the paper and began reading, her lips moving slightly as her eyes scanned the text. For the first few lines, her expression remained bored and dismissive. Then I saw it happen, the shift. The moment her face changed from arrogance to confusion to something that looked very much like fear. Her hands began to tremble. The paper shook visibly between her fingers. She read the same section twice, 3 times, as if hoping the words would rearrange themselves into something different. "What is this?" Her voice came out thin and strained. She looked at Howard, then at me, then back at the document. "This is not what we discussed. This is not what Thomas wanted." Howard folded his hands on the desk. "Mrs. Whitman, perhaps you should read the relevant passage aloud so that everyone in the room understands what you are being asked to affirm." Carol's eyes darted back to the paper. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "By signing below, I affirm that I have not engaged in undue influence, coercion, financial exploitation, or psychological manipulation of Thomas Andrew Collins during the period of our marriage. I understand that evidence contradicting this affirmation may result in criminal prosecution, forfeiture of inheritance, and civil liability." She looked up at me with wild eyes. "You did this. You poisoned him against me." I did not respond. I simply watched her unravel. Howard reached into his folder and pulled out a second document. "Mrs. Whitman, I should inform you that the will you believe to be current is not in fact Mr. Collins' final testament. 8 months before his death, your husband contacted me privately and executed a new will in the presence of 2 independent witnesses. This document was properly notarized and filed according to Wisconsin state law. It supersedes all previous versions." He slid the new will across the table. Carol did not touch it. She stared at it like it was a coiled snake. "That is not possible," she said. "He could not have done that without me knowing. He was too confused. He could not even remember what day it was half the time." On the contrary, Howard replied, Mr. Collins was evaluated by his physician 2 days before signing this document. Dr. Lowell confirmed that he was of sound mind and fully capable of making his own decisions. I have that evaluation on file along with video documentation of the signing itself. Sarah was gripping my hand so tightly I could feel the bones shifting. She had not known any of this. I had kept it from her to protect her, knowing she could not have hidden her emotions from Carol if she had known what was coming. Howard continued. Additionally, Mrs. Whitman, I have in my possession approximately 52 hours of audio recordings made inside your home over the past 7 months. These recordings were made with Mr. Collins' full knowledge and consent using equipment concealed in an antique clock in the master bedroom. Carol's face went completely white. For a moment, I thought she might faint. Those recordings document numerous instances of verbal abuse, financial manipulation, and what appears to be deliberate over-medication of a vulnerable adult. They also include your own admission that you had, in your words, finally gotten rid of those ungrateful brats and that you intended to, quote, take everything that old fool has before he realizes what is happening. Sarah gasped beside me. I squeezed her hand. Carol started crying. Not the elegant, performative tears she had displayed at my father's funeral. These were ugly, desperate sobs that twisted her face into something unrecognizable. Mascara ran down her cheeks in dark streaks. You do not understand, she choked out between sobs. He was confused. I was protecting him. I was the only one who took care of him. You abandoned him. Both of you abandoned him. I finally spoke. My voice was steady and cold. We did not abandon him, Carol. You locked us out. You deleted our messages. You threw away our letters. You made him believe his own children did not love him anymore. And while he was dying alone in that house, you were draining his accounts and planning your next vacation. She turned to me with pleading eyes. Henry, please. I made mistakes, but I loved him. I truly loved him. No, I said you loved his money, and now you get neither. Howard Keene calmly gathered the documents while Carol continued to sob in her chair. He explained that copies of the audio recordings and financial evidence had already been submitted to the district attorney's office. An investigation into elder abuse and financial exploitation was officially underway. Carol would not be signing anything today. In fact, she would be hearing from law enforcement within the week. She tried to argue. She tried to claim the recordings were illegal, that she had never consented to being recorded in her own home. Howard informed her that Wisconsin is a one-party consent state and that my father had provided full written authorization for the recordings before his death. Every legal requirement had been met. Every box had been checked. My father had made certain of that. When Carol refused to leave the office voluntarily, Howard called building security. 2 uniformed guards escorted her out through the lobby while she screamed that we had conspired against her, that we had manipulated a sick old man, that she would sue us for everything we had. The receptionist watched with wide eyes as Carol was led to the elevator, still shouting threats that echoed off the marble floors. The doors closed, and she was gone. Sarah Collins collapsed against me, shaking with tears that were equal parts grief and relief. I held her for a long time in that quiet conference room while Howard Keene respectfully excused himself to give us privacy. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red and swollen, but there was something else there too. Something that looked like peace. He knew, she whispered. Dad knew we loved him. He always knew, I said. She just made him forget for a while. Over the following months, the legal system did its work. Carol was charged with financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult fraud and criminal neglect. The evidence was overwhelming. The audio recordings alone would have been enough, but combined with the bank statements showing unauthorized withdrawals, the testimony from my father's doctor about suspicious changes in his medication, and the statements from neighbors who had witnessed Carol's controlling behavior, the prosecution had an airtight case. Carol's attorney advised her to plead no contest, She received 4 years of probation, was ordered to pay full restitution of the funds she had stolen, and was issued a permanent restraining order, prohibiting any contact with me, Sarah, or our families. She lost everything she had schemed so hard to take. The house went back to us. Walking through that front door for the first time after the trial was one of the hardest things I had ever done. The rooms looked different. Carol had redecorated everything, erasing my mother's touch from every corner. But some things she could not change. The foundation was still solid. The bones of the house were still the same ones that had sheltered our family for decades. Sarah and I spent an entire weekend going through my father's belongings. In the garage, I found his old woodworking tools still organized exactly the way he had always kept them. In the closet, Sarah discovered a shoebox filled with letters our mother had written to him when they were dating. We sat on the bedroom floor and read them aloud to each other, laughing and crying at the same time. But the most important thing we found was the letter my father had left for me tucked inside the envelope with his will. I read it alone that night, sitting in my workshop, surrounded by the smell of sawdust and wood polish. "Henry," he wrote, "I know I failed you these last years. I let someone convince me that your silence meant you did not care when the truth is, I was the one who stopped reaching out. Your mother would have seen through Carol in a heartbeat. I was not as sharp as her, but I want you to know that I never stopped loving you. I never stopped being proud of the man you became. The clock in our bedroom still keeps perfect time. I think you know why. Take care of your sister. Take care of your boys. And do not let bitterness make you hard. Love, Dad." I keep that letter in my workshop now, tucked in a drawer where I can read it whenever I need to remember who my father really was. Not the confused, isolated man Carol tried to create. The real Thomas Collins, a man who loved his family so much that he spent his final months planning one last act of protection. People ask me sometimes if I feel guilty about what we did about the recordings, the secret will, the trap we set for Carol in that lawyer's office. I tell them the truth. I feel nothing but gratitude. Gratitude that my father trusted me enough to ask for help. Gratitude that I had the chance to give him justice. Gratitude that he died knowing his children still loved him. Carol tried to erase us from his life. In the end, she only erased herself. If there is a lesson in all of this, it is simple. If someone tries to come between you and the people you love, do not wait until it is too late to fight for them. My father waited too long to reach out. He almost ran out of time, but he did not give up. In his final months, sick and weak and running out of days, he found the strength to protect his family one last time. That is the man I will always remember. That is the legacy he left behind, and that is why I am sharing this story with you today. If this story touched your heart, if it made you think about the people in your own life who matter most, I am asking you to do 3 things. First, share this video with someone who needs to hear it. You never know who might be going through something similar, who might need to know that they are not alone. Second, leave a comment below and tell me your thoughts. I read every single one, and your stories inspire me more than you know. And third, if you have not already, please subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another story. Thank you for watching, thank you for listening, and remember, the people who love you are worth fighting for.